Hi everyone, and welcome to this panel on science writing and popular trade non-fiction, and also sort of science-y writing. My name is Ed Lake. I'm a publishing director at Profile Books, which is an independent trade publisher in London. And I'm very, very pleased to be joined today by two brilliant profile authors. Gavin Francis is a GP and writer, both of travel writing, but also medical writing. His books include the very brilliant Adventures in Human Being, a terrific bestseller, the recent Island Dreams, which is an absolutely wonderful book, and his most recent book with Profile tips the balance fairly decisively in favour of medicine over travel, although he seems to have done more travel than some of us. It's intensive care, and it's a diary of a GP's diary of the COVID year, and it's an absolutely tremendous book, wise, full of hard-won wisdom, very beautiful life writing, but also sort of by necessity, it's a sort of expert on-the-ground view of, you know, perhaps the biggest science story that any of us are going to live through. Also with us is Fraser MacDonald, who is a historical geographer and the author of Escape from Earth, which is absolutely astonishing secret history of the early days of rocketry in the US. It sort of completely rewrites the early history of the American space program and hoists from obscurity a really unsung hero named Frank Molina, who, as Fraser compellingly argues, was scrubbed from the historical record owing to his communist associations. If you like space science with an admixture of Red Scare, skullduggery, espionage, and a certain amount of black magic, I really don't think you've got another option. This is it, and you're certainly in for an amazing time. Anyway, we're here to talk about popular science and science writing, and I mean it's a pretty broad church. There's famously the demarcation problem in the philosophy of science, which essentially holds that you can't state in a principled way what makes something a proper science or not, and I suppose that problem must be even more severe for books about it. At Profile, we publish a lot of what I think of as proper science writing, and always have done. We celebrated our 25th birthday this year, and throughout the years we've published a lot of really wonderful scientists. Just this year, I've published myself. I've published books by the Guido Tonelli, the spokesman for CERN, who announced the discovery of the Higgs boson. He's written a brilliant history of the universe called Genesis. I've published a new theory of consciousness by the man who discovered the brain basis for dreaming. I've published the geological travelogue. I'm very interested in how popular science works. But the space for science writing is a sort of contested one, I think, in some ways, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about first of all what the space for sort of scientific expertise in the public sphere looks like to both of you. I'm certainly very interested in how perhaps there was a sort of a gentle retreat from the sort of imperial high watermark of popular enthusiasm for science around the sort of zenith of the new atheism period, sort of 10 to 15 years ago, and then that sort of gave way to other culture wars with a slightly more ambivalent sort of feeling about the status of scientific expertise. And now my sense is that if anything makes you appreciate expertise, it's living through the global pandemic, and there seems to be more of an interest again in what scientists can tell us and how well we can understand what they're saying to us. But before we get into that, perhaps I could hand over to you, Gavin, to talk a little bit about your career and thoughts on how science has informed your writing and your
Sure.
thoughts.
Oh, thanks, Ed. So yeah, as Ed explained, I'm a general practitioner half the week, and the other half the week I write books. I began my enthusiasms with my enthusiasms as a teenager, actually wanting to be a geographer like Fraser. I was very interested in maps and mapping the world, and wanted to increase my understanding of the environment that surrounded me through mapping. But then something interesting happened. Somebody gave me a kid's atlas of anatomy, and I became kind of enthralled by that other world, that kind of landscape within. And I decided to switch and train to become a doctor. So I qualified in medicine 22, 23 years ago, and went back in a way to that old love of geography and travel, in the sense that I became a traveling doctor for a number of years and worked all over the world. And it was only once I'd finished about a decade of travel and work and was settled down essentially with a family of my own that I began to write. And for me, the act of trying to write about, whether it's about medicine or about travel, I don't really have that much of a distinction in my mind. I start out with an idea that I want to explore, whether it's, for example, Ed mentioned this book, Adventures in Human Beings. So that is a book which takes the concept, it's quite a medieval concept, that the body is a kind of landscape that has to be kept in balance. It's made up of the four humors, which mirror the four elements of matter, and that we can explore the landscape within just the same way as we explore a landscape without. And what it tries to do is look at the way, just as when a travel writer goes to a geographical landscape and talks about contemporary encounters, talks about the history of that place, talks about the culture, we can do the same thing for the body. And it sort of tries to use that same enthusiasm that comes from the travel writing world for a new place and reflect it back onto the body. And so when I approached writing that book, the science in that book is about the same kind of level of communication, really, that I do every day in the clinic. When I'm trying to explain to a patient what their kidney failure, for example, means to them, I have to modulate my language according to the understanding of the patient. And I have to try and use metaphor, simile, and a great deal in order to try and make it comprehensible. And when I come to write a book, I just have to pick a kind of level, I suppose, a level of understanding for my reader that I imagine, and do exactly the same thing as I would do in clinic, in terms of trying to use the appropriate parameters, I guess, of explanation. But the key, I suppose, what I want to get across is that whether it's science writing or travel writing, it doesn't really matter to me. It's about the language, it's about the story that you pick out, the story that you choose from all the multitude of possible facts that you're bringing out for the reader, and about tracing a kind of elegant, interesting narrative for them to follow. Ed, do you want me just to talk about the various other books just now, or do you want us to go into more of a conversation about that at this point?
Well, why not talk a little bit about some other books, and then we can sort of pick up some threads from what you said as we go on.
That's fine. So Adventures in Human Being was a book that takes the idea of the body as a landscape that can be explored just like any other landscape, and with a particular interest in the cultural history of the way we imagine the body. And I also wrote a book for Profile Wellcome about the body's transformations, which was a very similar kind of approach, in the sense that each chapter was an essay that examined a different element or different aspect of our medical, of my medical work. But every chapter in this one, rather than being about a part of the body as a landscape, was about a different kind of transformation, whether that is the natural transformations that we all go through with conception, birth, puberty, menopause, and in aging, or whether it was about transformations that are more in the realm of illness, such as, for example, anorexia nervosa, cancer, gigantism and hormonal disturbances like that. So I explored all these different ways in which our bodies transform throughout our lives, and how the route of transformation ultimately means that in medical practice, for me, there's always an element of hope, because nothing stays the same. Everything is always shifting. And with the right kind of nudges, the hope of medicine is always that you can nudge things in the right direction. From the point of view of travel writing, even when I've written about travel, I've always been so inspired by the world of science, really, that I've tried to find ways of communicating that in my travel books. So I'm thinking now about, I wrote a book now 2012, so 9 years ago, about being a doctor in Antarctica, where I was for 14 months. And being a doctor at a remote research station with nothing but ice, light and sky for a long period of time was a kind of, it's an experience of almost sensory deprivation, but also sensory overload. And when your world is so simple and so elemental and composed, as I say, of just purely ice and light, I became very fascinated by those elements just of ice and of light. And so that book has lots of digressions about the aurora, about why the sky is blue, about cloud formations, about the millions of beautiful ways in which water molecules can arrange themselves, whether in the sky or in beneath our feet. And I found that a really lovely way into thinking about different elements of science. It was very much inspired by a book that I came across early on, recommended to me by Kathleen Jamie. I'm going to show you. So if you're interested in science writing, How to Make Science Lyrical, this is a great book. Water, Ice and Stone by Bill Green. He's essentially a chemist who spent his whole life studying the Antarctic lakes, and he writes with great elegance and eloquence about things like calcium ions. So I can really recommend that kind of approach too. So in short, in summary, my impression of a good way to approach science writing from my point of view is that it's just like any other kind of writing. You've got the initial idea, you've got various narrative elements that you want to weave into the story. You want to write the best sentence you can to convey the concept that you want to convey in the most concise but yet the most eloquent way that you can. And then ultimately you have to have in your mind some sort of narrative shape of the story from beginning to end. And the fact that the elements of that story are about calcium ions, or the movement of the thermohaline circulation through the ocean, or about the way clouds form, rather than the fact they're about, I don't know, interpersonal difficulties with your neighbors, or the difficulties of the nuclear family as they might be in a novel, doesn't really matter. It's you're still trying to give the same experience to the reader of a satisfying journey that you're taking them on.
That's fascinating, and a lot of very rich ideas to draw on. One thing that really strikes me is actually something that I've noticed in quite a few writers that I've worked with, is that sort of having done some travel writing is often a really good sort of gives authors a really good way of thinking about other kinds of writing that they do. And some of my favorite writers to work with sort of wrote travel books first, and then other kinds of books later that drew on the sort of travel writers' sort of combination of imagination and attentiveness to experience. Fraser, your book, although very satisfyingly full of sort of science and engineering history, very much is about problems with the neighbours, and also the nuclear family in a slightly different way. Can you tell us a little bit about how Escape from Earth took shape, and how you came to write it, and how its writing is different from other kinds of more formal science writing that you've done?
Sure. Well, morning, everyone. So yeah, as Ed was saying, my book is really it's a history of rocket science, but it's as much about the kind of domestic and political and cultural contexts in which these ideas have developed. And although it centers on one key character, so my main man is this guy called Frank Molina, who's an engineer and then becomes an artist. It's got this cast of kind of outlandish weirdos, which I found like enormously kind of stimulating to kind of work with. I'm probably not going to say a huge amount about it in detail about my book, and indeed I've kind of written a lot less than Gavin. And so, but what I thought I could do is to reflect on some of the things that I either wish I'd known at the outset of starting a big science writing project, or things I've kind of learned along the way that I think are potentially useful for imagining an audience here, people who might want to write about science, or perhaps not just science, perhaps narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction, serious, can we say that, nonfiction of one kind or another.
We can.
And so actually just of the things that I think are most useful, and something that really helped me out in writing Escape from Earth, one is just to spend time in actual bookshops, which is such a kind of underrated thing to say. And it's a kind of obvious thing to say, but it makes a big difference. So you get a sense of just being able to browse, not like Amazon, but actually being able to browse and ideally strike up chat with booksellers. I found hugely useful. An example of that is quite early on in my writing, before I'd kind of properly tried to pitch anything, or before I'd got an agent or anything like that, a bookseller said, "Okay, so you're trying to write about this. Where is this book going to sit on the shelf?" And I actually hadn't really thought about that. And of course, it's such an obvious question, and it makes you think as a prospective writer. It makes you think about genre and subgenre. What is this book like? It's not going to sit in more than one place in the shop. And of course, that to some degree sets reader expectations. And I think that's a really, really useful thing to think about when you're trying to kind of conceive a book. And so the second thing then is kind of related to this, which is really spending time, again, Gavin kind of just mentioned it, really, which is about trying to think about the kind of conception or the framing of the book. Can it pull in readers who are not specifically interested in my case, in the history of rocket science? Like I was really, as Ed knows very well, being my editor here, trying to sell a book on the history of rocket science to people who were not potentially interested in the history of rocket science, but trying to pull in readers who are interested in a bigger story about the 20th century, about the big themes of the 20th century, whether it be Cold War geopolitics or developments in science, but all kind of seen through this kind of odd cast of characters in 1930s, 1940s Los Angeles, right? And so thinking about how you frame the book, how you conceive it, how can you make the science, or perhaps social science or history or whatever it is, how can you make it meaningful to readers? So it's partly about title and content and tone, but it's also about the story. What's the story of the science that's going to be told here? I probably don't need to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's just it's so obvious, but it bears repeating, that if you're trying to develop a book, you need to remember that book is a commercial proposition. Essentially, you're asking your publisher, you're selling a business idea, essentially, and having some mind to that. Obviously, my perspective is that of an academic who's then kind of moved into more kind of trade writing, I suppose. I think it's very easy for others who might think about doing the same. It's quite easy to forget that this is a kind of a commercial enterprise, and you can't just say, oh, well, there's a gap in the literature. Yeah, like, of course, there are lots of gaps in the literature. I've heard lots of people say that as a justification for why they might write a book, but in fact, you really need to try and forge a kind of a bigger connection, to a bigger readership, really. Third quick thing, which is about one of the things that really helped me was trying to understand a bit better the ecology of publishing, which again it's not about writing per se, but it is about trying to understand the landscape of publishing and the individual kind of roles of people who inhabit that landscape. So editors and agents and distributors and booksellers, you know, reviewers, and of course, most important, readers, right? And when you know how the system works, I think you've got a much better chance of being able to steer your own science project through to successful completion. And if it does get rejected, which sometimes books do, it's less about you per se or about the manuscript, then sometimes it's just about fit. You know, does this book really fit in the backlist of this particular publisher? I think it's helpful to really understand how the system works, that can, in ways that can really help you navigate it. And that's probably a good point just to mention here about agents, because I think, so I'm talking in a very nuts and bolts way about how all this works, but I think in some ways that's what aspiring writers really need to know. And agents, yes, it's perfectly possible to publish a book without an agent, but it does really help, and it helps you both refine your ideas, but it will, and perhaps help develop a proposal. But the main thing is that they are, of course, experts in this landscape and can make sure that your proposal, your idea, sits on the desk of the right commissioning editor. I suppose I'd give a shout out to editors, given that editors on the call here. Ed did a terrific job on my book, not least by, you know, taking 15,000 words out. Only hurt a little bit, but made a much better book as a consequence. And I think it's quite easy to not quite recognize the expertise that's brought to bear by editors, and you should really you know, kind of really listen to them. Okay, so a lot of that, what I've said just now, is just about the groundwork, and just a couple of quick things about the writing of, in my case, Escape from Earth. I think it's really worth digging deep when it comes to research. I mean, Gavin and I both have a certain kind of relationship between our jobs, as it were, and our writing. In my case, I'm an academic and I've done some academic history of science. I wouldn't say when I started, I was an expert in astronautical history. I guess I became one in the course of writing this book. But I think it's really important to mention that, in my view at least, you don't have to be an expert necessarily. You can acquire expertise, but you do have to be a credible observer. So you've got to have some sort of relationship with the material that makes you trusted by the reader. And then the last thing I was probably going to say just about writing, which is, I think, the real challenge for me in writing Escape from Earth, and more generally, I think it's just finding your own authorial voice, trying to use that consistently, using it to take us through the big kind of narrative arc, bearing in mind that the bigger story is itself consists of lots of kind of little stories and plot twists along the way. And so what we're trying to do, I guess, is trying to sort of think about a sort of seamless balance of advancing the story, carrying some ideas and argument along the way, and all the time kind of bringing these contexts alive in the mind of a reader. And for me, I think a lot of that comes down to having well-chosen details, often which are very kind of rigorously researched. And as an academic, you know, we're used to putting details, whether it be narrative details or descriptive details, putting them to work for purely analytic or interpretive purposes, when in fact, in the course of narrative nonfiction, you might be using it just to set a scene or establish a mood or make a character vivid. And I think that is not a lesser role for the research. You might be kind of harvesting all this detail and putting it to work just to set a scene. And I think that's great, because the whole task here is connecting, helping a reader connect with material. And, you know, fundamentally, as I see it, writing about science, whether you're want to write about an idea or a person or a story or scientific discovery, what the reader wants is to see your kind of excitement and your curiosity and your intensity about this. and be carried by that. And I think that is often made, that kind of work of connection is often made just through an authorial voice, which I suppose is just a literary way of saying you being you. And I guess, yeah, that these are some of the things that I kind of reflected on after the writing of this. And I hope might be of some use to other people who might be thinking about doing this kind of writing.
There's an awful lot there to think about, and I think it would be very useful to come back to some of that, especially the quite sort of practical, as you say, nuts and bolts quality of some of these thoughts. I think are really useful, and we can expand on those for a bit. Perhaps what we should do is take a sort of look at the sort of general outlook for sort of serious non-fiction, sciencey non-fiction, and then have a look at some sort of nuts and bolts questions, and then sort of zoom out to consider exciting prospects for the future. Does that sound?
That's good.
All right. Well, so I mean, we touched on a couple of things already, but it does seem to me that we're in a moment where there's a new interest in what's going on, and what's going on is so deeply involved in lots of large scientific stories that that there's a kind of new urgency to some of the possibilities for science writing that's coming out now. So I mean, they're sort of, I mean, I don't know if you'd quite call it science writing, but Failures of State, the big kind of COVID expose that has been a bestseller. We're about to publish Jeremy Farrar's reflections on COVID next month. That's called Spike. And climate change, for 20 years, it was very difficult to get books to work about climate change, but there seems to be a new appetite for that. At the same time, my sense is that within the sort of pure pop science sort of market, the emotional tone is sort of much more sort of modest and almost exploratory, almost sort of taking that travel writer's spirit and showing you in quite an unassuming way often, a fabulous new world that you can explore. I mean, how does it look from where you both are sitting?
No, it's really interesting that there's certain kind of topics come and go in terms of fashion. We've known for many years that climate change is going to be the defining issue of our particular era, and that the books are only just starting to sell about that. That's fascinating. There's also this really how different trends come and take over for a while. There was the trend, remember 10, 15 years ago, there was all misery memoirs. Everybody was publishing books about unhappy childhoods. And then we've had a lot of really fascinating medical memoirs recently, and the farming memoirs, they're becoming a big thing. And so I'm kind of fascinated by that, how that movement goes. But as an individual writer, that's a job for you, Ed, as a publisher, to try and identify these trends. I can't modify what I write according to the trend. I don't feel like I can. Like, I can't say, well, this is the tone that I need to adopt if I want to get a bestseller. I just have to write the book that I want to write. I'm just going to on the theme of different kind of approaches to science and medical writing, I would show a couple of examples really of books that I find really inspirational and really reassuring. That people just follow their own particular voice. So, there's this wonderful book that some of you all know about immunity called On Immunity by Eula Biss, which is a book about immunization and about the history of vaccination, as written by somebody who isn't a scientist by background, but became deeply, deeply fascinated by that issue and concerns about her own son's vaccinations. And it's a beautiful book because it comes at the subject from all sorts of unexpected angles that you wouldn't expect a scientist to approach it from. I'm not long finished reading Suzanne O'Sullivan's new book about mass hysteria, mass psychological illness. Again, she's a consultant neurologist, so she approaches things in a lovely way with sort of direct examples from the clinic, but then travels all over the world and explores the evolving understanding of these kinds of phenomena of mass hysteria and how we're starting to get a grip of them. But from a different perspective, you know, she's a consultant neurologist, so she's got that authority to fall back on. Just the other different ways of approaching non-fiction ideas. You know, some of you might know this book by Teju Cole, Blind Spot.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's really strange book, really weird. Like, it's just got, you know, odd photographs that he'll take, and then he'll write a completely off the wall essay inspired by that photograph that will take you in all sorts of interesting angles. So I suppose what my point is that much as I would like the ability in some ways to be able to manipulate what it is that I write in order to fit a market, I just feel like I can't do that. You know, that the books that I love are the books that are emblematic of that particular author's attitude, approach, and sometimes there's just an alchemy there where the book works beautifully because there's just the right amount of authorial authority, if that's not what's that, a pleonasm? Yeah. And there's the right amount of there's the right amount of personal memoir with the science brought in, with reflections on the broader picture, and the whole thing just works with a real kind of balance. And just to conclude, the last thing I would say about approaches to writing is, this is another one I can really recommend people. It's a tiny little book, The Writing Life by Annie Dillard. Look how thin it is, really small. But it's just a magnificent book in terms of reassuring people about how to approach becoming a writer. And it's got a great anecdote in it where one of Annie Dillard's writing students comes up and says, "Do you really think I could be a writer?" And Annie Dillard says, "Well, I don't know. Do you like sentences?" And the kid is really confused. He says, "What do you mean? I'm 20 years old and do I like sentences?" And she said, "Well, that's a shame that he didn't know how to answer that, because if he did like sentences, then he could begin, because he would spend all day doing something he enjoyed, like a painter I knew who loved to paint because he liked the smell." And I think that's a really beautiful, inspirational way of thinking about it. You know, do you want to embark on this huge project, which can take you years of your life, often for very little financial reward? Well, yes, if you love sentences.
If you love fixing sentences, especially.
As an editor, yeah.
My friend Ross Anderson, who's deputy editor at The Atlantic, sort of occasionally melancholically would reflect on the sad lot of the writer, that you have to spend so much time with your own writing before it's good.
So true.
I very much take your point that I mean, it may almost be a paralyzing thought for a writer to sort of think too much about what the trends are that sort of surround the kind of writing that they're involved. And apart from anything else, it takes a bloody long time to write a book. And although publishing trends are slower than you know, the currency in other areas of popular culture, they, you know, you'd still need to be going fast to hit them sometimes.
I really kind of connected with what Gavin had said about as a writer, we don't really have the same sort of overview that you have, Ed, as you know, and that's, for me, that's why spending time in bookshops is just really useful to see what else is going on. Even books I'll never read, or even not read or buy, but just to think, oh, okay, that's happening, and you get a sense of changing tastes. But I really find it hard to kind of calibrate my own writerly desires to what I think will what's necessarily current, as it were. I think the other thing to say about that is, I don't know about everybody else on this call, but I'm an exceptionally lazy reader. Like, I really am a terrible reader. I have multiple books going on at the same time. I quite often don't finish. Can I even say that? I quite often don't finish a book.
You're among friends.
But I think it's relevant, because that's what I'm looking for in books in this genre, I suppose. And I'm not and perhaps I'm reading a bit less popular science than I used to. I too, like Gavin, have just picked up that Susanna Sullivan book, because I just thought, oh, it's just such an interesting, what's called The Sleeping Beauties, is it, Gavin? Looks like such an interesting take, where, and that what for me is a really winning combination, is somebody who brings to bear the weight of their expertise. You know, Gavin does this really well, also with a certain kind of putting themselves front and center, really, where you kind of this sort of hybridizing of science writing and a memoir. And I think that the memoir aspect, yeah, I don't know again about the kind of broader trends in publishing, but it feels to me it's just such a useful device for entraining the interest of a reader. And I was really struck by something that the late historian Lisa Jardine said in relation to history, which is that the task of the historian, as she saw it, is to give readers emotional access to the past, to make the past, as my kids say, relatable. And I think that memoir and the personal is just an obvious way of doing that. So that's kind of what I would be looking for, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting connection, I suppose, between the writing of science and the putting oneself in the story. There's a sort of almost a sort of ideological tension there between, you know, the authenticity of individual testimony on the one hand, and the sort of, you know, impersonal repeatability of the kinds of evidence that we take to be scientific on the other. But I definitely, I think that there's nothing quite like speaking in your own voice about your own experience to compel a readership, and I think that that's unlikely to change. I mean, do you your thoughts on the usefulness of visiting bookshops? I thought were sort of well taken, because that's sort of that's not about kind of hitting trends necessarily, but it's sort of about seeing what's there and you know what people are interested in, whether or not on a temporary basis. I actually run a non-fiction prize for academics who are writing first books. It's called the Ideas Prize, and I run it with Aitken Alexander, and we've done it for a few years now. And it's people submit proposals, and it's absolutely fascinating seeing what people are working on, and you know the kind of ideas that are out there. But it's also sort of sometimes quite clear whether or not the person who's written this pitch sort of reads very much popular writing. You can kind of tell, you know, whether they have a sense of what it's like when you're talking to a popular audience. I mean, I was very interested in your comment earlier, Gavin, about how, you know, it's like talking to a patient. You sort of calibrate the language and the metaphorical range that you draw upon, sort of depending on who you think you're talking to. And how do you think about who you're talking to when you're writing for a general audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had my training in this with writing pieces for the LRB, really, and New York Review, where the editors there are, you get these fantastically detailed back and forward edits. You know, you might a piece for an essay or a review essay for those papers might come back and forward 4 times before, 5 times before it goes to press, and the editors there are like yourself, Ed, phenomenally intelligent people who are very well versed in lots of different areas of human endeavor, but might not have a very specific scientific knowledge. They've maybe got an arts background, humanities background. They haven't done particularly a great deal of science since they were teenagers. And so often the question, it'll just keep coming back to me that you know, you have to explain this to somebody who's intelligent but doesn't know the science. So, you know, you have to...
knowing things is really my only asset as an editor.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's a great danger for an editor, is getting a book that they're already an expert in, because then they'll sign off everything like, oh yeah, this...
It'll never happen.
So that was a great training for me in terms of the books that I've written, having written those for those paper magazines, whatever you want to call them. So I think, yeah, I've got that ideal reader. When I'm with a patient, it's far easier, of course, because you can tentatively explore metaphors and watch their face to see for the recognition instead of just writing it into a page. But the idea is the same, that I'm sort of gently trying to push the limits or the understanding using very kind of normal everyday metaphors where I can. Often, as Fraser says, by bringing it back to my own experience. So you'll tell a short story about from your own experience that everyone can relate to, but then hopefully that will be the key to unlock, oh yeah, of course, understand. So an example might be the way, just because I can see it in my eyeline, Suzanne O'Sullivan's book, she'll be talking about how mass hysteria works, and she'll be explaining that you know, if you're in a room, a hot, stuffy room where people start to faint, then that can be quite frightening. And the feeling that you get as that starts to happen and people are hitting the deck can itself give you the sense that maybe you're about to collapse too, and it becomes self-fulfilling in a way. And the way that she approaches explanation of mass hysteria and those, or we shouldn't call it that anymore, as she repeatedly makes, mass psychological illness, I thought works very well. And I try to do the same. I'll take a short story, a anecdote from my own life that I hope illuminates or illustrates what I'm trying to get across.
I mean, stories are so incredibly powerful as a way into any kind of body of sort of information that you want to convey. There's a reason it's proven such a durable cultural form. Fraser, I mean, do you have thoughts on what's a useful way to think about who's out there?
When we say who's out there, would you mean an audience or
audience?
Yeah, I'm slightly haunted in a way. I mean, sometimes, and this is true when I was writing the book. Not haunted is not right, but I definitely felt. I was going to say the burden. That's not quite putting it right, but the presence, as it were, of an imagined reader. And so, and I found that actually quite useful because, I mean, it's quite useful to have a sense of who's going to read this book. And initially, it's going to be, you know, editor or agent or whatever. But just, you know, thinking when you're writing, like, how will people connect to this paragraph? Will I be able to carry them from this paragraph to the next one and then into the next chapter? And a sense of always feeling the responsibility of rewarding the reader's attention. And I suppose I found that to be actually ultimately quite a useful yardstick for actually working out what to cut and what to keep in, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it's all such an abstract thing. And of course, when the book comes out and you actually connect with real readers, and in my case, you know, you sort of read all, you know, reviews, and press reviews are really different from reader reviews. And actually, it's the reader reviews and like Amazon or whatever that are some ways the most interesting. In my case, of people saying there are not nearly enough rockets in this book. You know. And I hear, and you know, my book's full of, you know, like doomed love and weird ritual ceremonial magic, and probably not enough rockets. But I did want to try and hold the attention of an ordinary reader, and I found that useful to kind of bear in mind. I just noticing that there's some interesting questions in the chat, and it might be an opportunity to also kind of remind people that they can also throw other questions in the chat as well.
Well, okay. Well, let's take this question from Alistair Appleby. He writes, if one has new ideas / research, should you publish them academically first in a journal before a book for the public?
No. Maybe. I mean, I did the idea of somehow, oh, well, you need to establish. I don't honestly believe in the need to establish some sort of academic authority as a basis, as itself a qualification for writing.
Yeah.
I just don't believe it. I mean, if you want to write academically, then do that, and that's good. There's lots of good reasons to do that, but I don't think it's a necessary step, I suppose.
Do you have thoughts on that, Gav?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're talking about trade publishing, aren't we?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a whole load of phenomenally successful trade writers who don't have the credentials to be taken seriously in that particular field, but it's because they're great storytellers. And that's what I presume you're looking for when you pick up on a unsolicited proposal that lands on your desk. You're not sitting checking, hang on, is this guy a professor of whatever his subject is? I mean, that probably doesn't interest you at all. In fact, sometimes, as Fraser is even implying, that might even conceivably be a handicap, because if you're an expert in that field, you make all kinds of assumptions, and academic writing has a different purpose. You know, it's got people, academics get paid for their writing in different ways, through promotions and sabbaticals. You know, they don't get paid through royalties. So I think it's just a completely different kind of endeavor, personally.
I think I agree with what both of you say, with the caveat that that if you are an academic with some big new idea about things who wants to reach a large popular audience, it can be useful if those ideas have been to some degree road tested amongst your authoritative peers first. I mean, apart from anything else, you know, the sort of reviewer infrastructure or ecology just isn't sort of cut out to evaluate kind of novel claims about how things work. So all they've really got to go on is you know, your credentials and whether or not they can kind of think that you're likely to be right. But that, I mean, that's not the recipe.
I'm just thinking within your own profile, for example, you know, you guys publish Mary Beard, who's a very kind of distinguished professor of classics, and she's a fabulously well celebrated public communicator as well, you know. So
yeah,
in a way, yeah, being a professor of classics buttresses her authority to be able to talk about these things. But I suppose, from my point of view as a reader of her work, I'm far more interested in her being a good communicator than I am in her chair of classics.
yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe that's an opportunity to ask you, Ed, because you're the person here who sees all these proposals coming across your desk. Can you say something about, you know, what is it that kind of grabs your attention when you see a proposal, and is academic authority something that's relevant there? You know, how do you judge whether there'll be or whether there'll be a market for a particular book when you see a proposal?
It depends on the nature of the book. So academic authority can be a useful asset for certain kinds of project. I mean, I think for sort of especially sort of the sort of STEMier end of popular science writing, it has felt for some time that readers sort of like to hear it from, you know, the person who did all of the experiments themselves, that there's a kind of you know, sort of coming down from the mountain with the tablets sort of quality to some science publishing. But you know, a lot of the most exciting science writing. I mean, so a good example of that actually is I don't know if you know Merlin Sheldrake's book Entangled Life, which came out this year, and is a sort of lovely exploration of the world of fungi, and makes somewhat startling claims about the role that fungi have played in the evolution of life on Earth. But I mean, it's also rooted in no slightly failed pun intended in Merlin's sort of quite disarmingly sort of and charmingly odd persona. He's sort of like a good candidate Doctor Who, and you know, is sort of a fearless psychedelic voyager, and you know, the brother of the folk musician Cosmo Sheldrake, and son of the biologist and paranormal investigator Rupert Sheldrake. And you know, the book happened to come along, you know, just after a summer at which weirdly it became you know, a sort of widely discussed trend that everyone was taking magic mushrooms. It was, you know, like a lot of things worked for that book. It was a Sunday Times bestseller, but it was, you know, it was exploratory. It was travel writing. You know, science writing as travel writing, but Merlin was, you know, the person who had done a lot of the research at the heart of it. So that was a combination of stuff that was very clearly attractive, and we bid for that book. We wanted to publish it. There's another question here. Ellen Stewart says, as an academic, the idea of getting an agent seems quite rare. No one I know has one, but I'm considering a more trade-oriented book. Is an agent worthwhile in that context?
Yeah, well, I've already made my views known on this, which is it really, really is. It really is. And people, I mean, I think sometimes people are hesitant to talk about agents, but just at a really, really practical level, if you can get a good agent, it's just such an enormous help to you as a writer. And one of the most useful things that was said is that, to me, is that if an agent shows interest in you, and what you're kind of really aiming for with an agent is it's not just like a one-shot deal about one book. It's about trying to set up a more longer-term relationship over multiple books, over a kind of career. And you know, sometimes that doesn't always work out, but quite often it does. And yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, Gavin, you'll have your own take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it's really helpful because as we both keep circling around to the fact that it's academic writing and trade writing are very different beasts. You know, and Fraser says it's a commercial proposition, not an ideas proposition. That it is that you're trying to sell, and the agent is the expert on how best to package and sell that and put it in the lap of the right person. You know, she, like my own agent Jenny, who's on this call, I think, is she knows Ed, she knows lots of different editors, she knows what their enthusiasms and passions are, she knows what they're willing to take on and what kind of book they would be best with. So yeah, I think it's really, really helpful. No, and what's your position, Ed? I mean, I know some of your authors don't have agents, but most of them do.
Most of them do. I mean, we don't have, from our point of view, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. We did a look at the profitability of books by sort of authors with agents versus authors without, and it turned out to make absolutely no difference to us. I think that for authors, though, it can be really helpful. I mean, Fraser remarked that it's good to have a good agent, and I think that you know, like with any kind of creative endeavor, it makes a world of difference whether or not you're talking to someone who sort of fundamentally gets what you're trying to do versus someone who doesn't. And so if you can find someone who, you know, works on the kinds of things that you admire or want to do, and sort of, you know, makes suggestions that when you hear them feel right rather than wrong, but you feel like you've got to do them, then that's definitely really worth having. You know, someone who can boost the signal of your thoughts about what you want to be doing is really.
And I noticed there's a question on exactly that in the chat about how, from Jason, how do we as new trade authors identify a good agent? And yeah, that is kind of hard, but I think that I suppose what I would do is chat to other writers who you think might have agents, or go to the acknowledgements of authors whose work you really admire and see who their agents are. I mean, agents, my sense is agents quite often specialize, not exactly in particular fields, but often have a certain sort of sensibility or a certain kind of author, and just get out and about and chat to people as much as possible to kind of read, you know, pick up the lore on that sort of stuff. And also happy if anybody wants to kind of drop me a line and chat about these things, I'm happy to do that.
I think that's good advice. Yeah, I mean, the more that you can sort of go to places where book people congregate and chat to them, the better. I mean, you know, agents are often at book launches and readings and, you know, all of these sorts of things. Find authors who you're interested in and follow them around.
Yeah, it'll be wonderful when we get to do these kinds of things in person again. I'm very sorry I'm not in Inverness.
I know, same.
Likewise, next year perhaps. I think we've probably got time for one more question, if anyone has one in mind, or if we've missed one. Alistair Appleby has the question, a large question. It seems academically that the science-humanities relationship is in an early formation or reformation. Do you think the public are ready to explore this area? I take this to be about a sort of a contest of authority between the sciences and the humanities. And
Cultures.
I mean, I think that it's possible that there's, you know, good book ideas to be written about the relationship between science and the humanities, or what each of them know. It would depend entirely on the take. That's my view.
I suspect it's something that's done best in the embodiment, as it were. So perhaps, you know, so much of the really great science writing we've been talking about in this session is actually from people who are wielding perspectives that are actually quite grounded in the humanities. And not all scientists can offer that. And I think that's a real kind of tension. And to my mind, I mean, I often have a beef about science writers who, or particularly scientists who want to write about their own field. In my case, like a lot of astronautical history written by engineers who like really into propellant chemistry and not at all interested in human relationships. But actually humanities perspectives on science are hugely important, and important for the readability of a book, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know if we're from my point of view, it does seem like we're getting a more balanced, nuanced relationship that's building since that you know, spat with C.P. Snow, and who was that literary academic who responded to him? Anyway,
it wasn't Leavis, was it?
Yeah, it was. Leavis wrote a response, which is kind of very telling about the about that era. Really, to read the two essays, you think, wow, you know, thankfully, we have really moved on hugely from that kind of polarized approach to the sciences and humanities that they had then. And I don't know, Fraser as a geographer skips gleefully between both. The geography is the perfect discipline to which, you know, that draws on both science and on human relationships. But more and more, you just explained beautifully, I think, Ed, why Marilyn Sheldrake's book works so well, because it takes some really interesting novel scientific ideas, but embeds them in a kind of human narrative, human landscape of stories that people who don't know anything about science can relate to and still be amazed by. So that's the kind of approach I think that we need to keep pursuing, not alienating one another, science versus humanities, but appreciating the different things that they have to offer.
That seems like a superb note on which to end. Thank you very much to Gavin and to Fraser, and I hope that we've answered all of the questions that people have, and that this has been a useful and stimulating session. It has been for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Fraser.
Cheers.